Japan's surprise and devastating attack on our Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 drove the United States into World War II. Japan had amassed a superior military to expand its empire. By 1942, it attacked and occupied the U.S. territories of the Philippines, Guam, and Wake, as well as the resource-rich countries of East Asia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and the Dutch Indies needed to fuel its ambitions. Mobilizing its people and its great industrial might to the war, the U.S. countered with its allies, pushing Japan back through many costly battles over 3 years. But the islands of Japan, its highly populated homeland, were isolated and protected by vast miles of ocean. Emperor Hirohito and his generals believed Japan could defeat the U.S. in any attack of the homeland, vowing to fight to the death without surrender to end the war. Adding to its military, 30 million Japanese citizens would be conscripted and armed to defeat any land invasion. The planned amphibious land assault of the Japanese homeland was expected to cost 1 million American lives, additional Ally lives, and up to 10 million Japanese lives over a bloody 1-year ground campaign. Fortunately, this staggering loss of life was avoided. The war was won from the air in 1945 with the introduction of a game-changer, the B-29 bomber, which could fly long-range 15-hour missions from new bases in the Marianas. The Japanese homeland was devastated with massive B-29 bombing, including incendiary and ultimately atomic bombs, all necessary to secure surrender from the fight-to-the-death emperor and his generals. Over 800 B-29s participated. The brave B-29 flight crews, averaging just 22 years of age, faced incredible danger and heavy takeoffs, engine loss fully loaded over open ocean, Japanese fighter and flak attacks, and probable starvation, torture, or execution if downed and captured. These were scary missions.
The B-29 was designated initially to be the long-range bomber to bomb Germany from Greenland and Nova Scotia. It turned out that the timing was such that it was too late for the European war and just barely available for what turned out to be the timing of World War II in the Pacific. And the B-29 was the only plane in the world that had the range to fly as far as we had to fly to bomb Japan. So we had to have taken the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, 3 of the main islands in the Marianas group, in order to provide only 14 to 15-hour mission time from the Marianas to Japan. Those 3 islands had 10 runways, all 8,500 feet long, 6 on Tinian, 2 on Saipan, and 2 on Guam. And that provided the capability of 1 bomber per minute off of each of those 10 runways, so we could get a lot of airplanes headed toward Japan at the same time, and did have as many as 800 in some of the very late missions of World War II. The runways on Tinian constituted the largest airport in the world at that time. The 6th Bomb Group was assigned to Tinian Island with its 45 crews and 45 airplanes, which had trained together in the United States before arriving in the Marianas. Planning for each mission was done on Guam, where the headquarters of the 20th Air Force were, and we were briefed about what the target was, what altitude, what type of bombs we had, whether it was a day mission or night mission, and we were briefed as pilots. A separate briefing was conducted for navigators. Another briefing was conducted for bombardiers. After being trucked from the briefing area, we were taken 2 or 3 miles to the flight line, where we met the ground crew who had sleeping quarters at the hard stand, asking them if there was anything that we should know about the airplane that represented a deficiency and might be a problem. And everybody then inspected the airplane. As an airplane commander, I inspected all of the crew to make sure they had their life jackets, their flak jackets, and their parachutes, and were prepared to go on the meeting. And by the way, we all carried a .45, made sure we had that with us. All of the crew was advised to go to the rear of the hard stand and have a nervous pee in preparation. Then we had a meeting with the chaplain of the 6th Bomb Group with each of the crews and had a prayer before we started the engine. Prior to our arrival at the flight line, ordnance people had already loaded bombs in the bomb bays up to the total of approximately 14 tons for a typical mission to Japan. Our flight crew, with the help of ordnance people, also loaded 10,000 rounds of 50 caliber machine gun bullets in the 5 turrets on the airplane. The added weight for fuel, crew, ordnance prior to takeoff was approximately 50,000 pounds for most missions. Takeoff was always one of the serious problems on any of the missions. The problem being we were over the specified maximum gross weight of 120,000 pounds as specified by Boeing, usually in the area of 128 or 130,000 pounds. And the airport was a little short with the runways for carrying that much weight, bomb load and gasoline, and getting it off the ground before you ran out of runway. We quickly learned that we were close to stall speed of 140 at the end of the runway when we took off, not from the runway, but from the airspace after the runway is when we started to climb. And the climb out, of course, was a pullback of power a little bit because we had a heating problem with the engines with sufficient airflow through the engine if we had the cowl flaps open. And that was the flight engineer's job during takeoff, was to milk the flaps closed to reduce drag as we went down the runway, and he was watching cylinder head temperatures on the engines to do that milking. We drove a stake about halfway down the runway, representing the point of no return. You make a decision at that point to either take off or abort, because if you can't stop 65 tons of airplane and load in the remaining portion of the runway, if you didn't start stopping at the stake. So that stake was put there and used for every crew. Every takeoff was concerned about being at 100 miles an hour at that point, with all the engines running perfectly. That was our green light to go ahead and try to take off from that point. I started something when I decided to take off, driving off the end of the runway, making use of the 80 feet elevation above sea level that the runway provided. That gave us an opportunity to either keep the plane level and get some additional speed, or dive a little bit and get some added speed, because we were above stall speed but just barely as we went off the end of the runway. We lost a number of 6-bomb group planes, as did other groups also lose on takeoff. The crew could relax from the next 7 hours except the flight engineer, the pilots, and the navigator. The navigator was continuously looking for, finding, making celestial fixes on whatever heavenly bodies were available to him. My navigator smoked 4 packs of cigarettes every mission we went on, and was tired because he was absolutely working every minute of the flight time. We had none of the comforts of home during the 7-hour flight to another 7 hours flight from target to home base. But we did have a little warming oven where we could put a sandwich in that we had brought with us to heat it up. We could get some coffee. The bathroom facilities were in all cases designed for men only, no walls, no doors. We had a bathroom in the form of a pitot tube with a funnel in the end that we could pee in, and it would exit the airplane. We also had a crapper in the gunner compartment where you may relieve yourself, but you had the job when you got back home of cleaning up your mess. In 1945, we didn't have LORAN, GPS, and all the navigational aids that are available to today's airplane pilots. Also lacking on these long missions was good information about the weather along the route that we were taking. We had no reporting stations on the route. We could get a little weather from the Aleutian Islands, but that's pretty far away. And of course, we got nothing from Japan in that area in the way of weather forecasts. I can remember a few missions when we had a front appear on radar that we were going to have to go through to go to target. And that front, we didn't have sufficient gas to look for a hole in it, so you had to put your head down and drive through it. And we encountered some extremely rough reactions from the updrafts and downdrafts in those fronts. We got to the point where your you'd hit the seatbelt holding you down till you're then forced to sit heavily on the seat because the airplane is coming up. And we had some cases where even on autopilot, because it reacts quickly to the planes going as far as 45 degrees from level wings. After a 3-hour flight, we passed over Iwo Jima, recently taken by the Americans from the Japanese, and the P-51s that had an escort mission that day then would follow us up to the coast of Japan, and upon arriving at the coast and expecting to see some Zeros, they would rose up and protected us on the rest of our mission. Celestial navigation over water was considered excellent. It could get you within 4 or 5 miles of the planned landfall position. Radar was a valuable navigational aid as we approached the coastline of Japan and could match the configuration of that coast with what the configuration was on a map. It was a positive indicator of exactly where you were. From that point, we navigated on Dead Reckoning to the initial point in preparation for the bomb run. There were 3 kinds of bombing missions. One was the conventional, dropping an explosive that damaged whatever it hit. Aerial burning, wherein we set large areas of highly populated sections of big cities on fire. And mining missions, wherein we put mines in the channels of those countries shipping raw materials to Japan. The 6th Bomb Group, under the direction of the Navy, sank 182 ships, Japanese cargo carriers, which was a higher number than the U.S. Navy sank of those types of ships during World War II. Mining missions were laid down in an area where the Navy had told us the channel was narrow. They had the shipping had to pass over it. The mines were let down on a parachute into the water, sank to the bottom, and awaited the passing of a magnetic field or some acoustical sound that would arm that mine and explode it, hopefully sinking the ship that was over it. So we were dropping by radar, and we took a picture of every single drop of every mine. And those were used after the war to permit the Navy to go in and clean out any unexploded mines that were in those channels. And they were very complimentary of our placing the bombs where they had said they wanted them. I don't know what a mine weighed. The bombs, they all had names for them. 500 pounds, 100 pounds, or whatever. Know what the weight of the mines were, but my guess was that they might weigh a ton apiece, in which case we could carry 14 of them on a mission. The firebombs, incendiaries, were about 5-6 feet long, and they were an explosive charge in the middle, surrounded by jelly gasoline contained in a long tube. And then this whole thing was bound together, and capability of exploding that center tube to scatter the burning tubes for maybe even a block-wide area on the ground. And they were not only exploded and separated, but they were lit on fire. And so it dropped all the way down to the ground, still on fire. First, and staying ahead of everybody else that was on that mission, was a Pathfinder plane whose mission was to fly through the part of the city considered to be the best target, a straight line through the part of the city we wanted to burn up. He dropped his bombs, which were visible to everybody else who was later take off, and their job was to fly parallel to and to the side of the line of fires created by the Pathfinder plane. The separation, 1/4 of a mile only, and that would drop one bomb away every second, a block or two apart, and later ones would fly on this side and expand out from that to try to get a contiguous fire in that whole area. And we were pretty successful at doing that, and not leaving the people that were in that area much of a chance to get out. It was burning in every direction that they might look. On all of the incendiary raids, you were flying over fires, and there were strong vertical air currents from those fires, which meant that you would get air coming up, immediately make you jump up, or coming down, or in some cases have one wing in and up and another wing in and down, and you're flying along like this, all of a sudden you're like this, even though you had it on autopilot, which is very quick to react. As soon as it is a few degrees off of a level, it tries to correct. Extremely rough. And in addition, after all the raids, we're dropping incendiaries. When we got home, we had an airplane that was stinky from burning flesh and sooty because it had been flying through smoke. We burned on the first Tokyo raid an area of 14 square miles, burned to the ground, 100,000 dead Japanese. A bigger area and more people than was the case in the bombing of Hiroshima with the A-bomb. But of course they did it with one bomb. I'm talking about 30 airplanes, all of them dropping several incendiary bombs. Some people have asked for the purpose of the incendiary blanket burning of the major cities in Japan. We knew, and it is true, that there were a broad amount of manufacturing taking place in what was called cottage industries. That is, somebody in one of these towns has a lathe, and he's making a part for assembly at one of the factories. And that was quite widespread throughout Japan, and that's a true statement. There is an auxiliary benefit, and that was to degrade the morale of the Japanese citizens, making them more prone to want to surrender. The firebombing and the mine-laying missions were all night missions. We did not want to be able to be seen by having no lights on the airplane. If they can't see you, they're not going to be able to shoot you very well with their anti-aircraft rifle on the ground. Those night missions were, both in the case of the mining and the firebombing, were low-level missions in the 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 foot elevation, whereas the conventional bombing was usually done in the 15,000 to 20,000 altitude area. The Japanese employed the use of searchlights to attempt to locate airplanes that they could hear, know they were up in the sky, but if there are no lights, they can't see you, they can't shoot at you, they won't be very accurate if they do. So the idea on the incendiary raids was to stay out of the searchlights, and they'd always have a couple of searchlights on any path you took, going back and forth through the sky, hoping to hit one airplane. If the searchlight got on a B-29, you could be certain that in 3 or 4 seconds there'd be 2 or 3 other searchlights on that same airplane, and those guys are in trouble because all the anti-aircraft stuff now can concentrate on something they can see, and several of them are shooting at the same airplane, so they're in trouble. We took it upon ourselves to shoot the searchlight with our own .50 caliber gunners. After a few missions of doing that, and by the way, that was quite successful in causing the searchlight to be turned off, either because we hit the searchlight and disabled it, or because the crew who was manning that searchlight decided they didn't want to subject themselves to the gunfire, turned it off. We don't know which, but the light went out. After doing a few missions, we got a from on high demand that we no longer shoot out searchlights, because an airplane had been hit from above with .50 caliber bullets from one of the searchlight shooters above. That did not sit well with most all of the crews that I heard from. Most of the bombs we dropped were the conventional bombs that exploded when they hit the ground or the building or whatever the target was. The bombardier had directional control of the airplane, from perhaps a couple miles from the target. The bomb site in the B-29 was the Norden bomb site. It is actually a mechanical computer with some cams, some slope curves that rollers follow, and some optics. And they had to be set initially with the altitude, the air temperature, the wind direction. And if you got all those things in accurately, and then if the bombardier did an excellent job of maneuvering to get over the target at the right location, which wouldn't be vertical to the target, it might be over to one side, depending on wind. And if you'd done a lot of good job, we could got the bombs on the target. And by and large, we did a pretty good job. There were no formations flying on any of the night missions, and only a part of the daylight missions. We only flew tight formation on perhaps 25% of our total missions were a tight formation, which we'd form off an island off the coast. And that required precise timing on everybody. They needed to arrive, form up and go around and around the island until they could go into the target. And of course, with the gas situation being what it was, you can't afford to dink around getting into a formation when you ought to be flying toward the target. A formation of 6 bomb group planes would consist of a lead group of 4, then 4 on this side and 4 on this side, a lead here on right and left, and then one down a little lower and behind. We would drop based on the lead crew. When that bombardier dropped, everybody dropped. And of course, we toggle out bombs 1 or 2 at a time. We unloaded the whole bomb bay with whatever bombs we were carrying, which could have been 100 pounds, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, or 2,000 pound bombs, depending on the target that had been assigned, whether we wanted to penetrate and bomb explode after penetration into the ground level for a ways to get more damage, or bomb explosion at the surface. The Japanese defended their target from coastline to initial point, from initial point to the bomb run. They abandoned us and left us alone over the target because, of course, they run the risk of being shot down if they're in the midst and among their B-29s that are attempting to be shot down by the Japanese. The Japanese flak was set to explode at the altitude of their target, B-29s. And generally they could do that pretty well. The direction wasn't that good. They weren't shooting usually at particular planes. If it was a single plane, they would go after it. But if they were in a group of planes, they would run a pretty good chance of getting some flak in some of those planes if they had it explode in front of the planes. So the planes were flying into a bunch of cast iron particles or pieces or big pieces. Most of the flak exploded into small pieces, providing little opportunity for severe damage to the B-29. On the other hand, some pieces were big enough that brought down B-29s. I had never had an occasion where any one of the flak holes we had was big enough to bring the airplane down. We did get a large piece through the bombardier's bomb sight glass, which is about 1.5 inches to 2 inches thick, shattered and scattered all over the flight deck. Also, the radar operator had a smaller piece come through over his shoulder into the scope in which he was looking. They were also subject to the firepower of the Japanese fighters, and they had a goodly number of guns. The Japanese fighter was a superior airplane, better than anything anybody had at the beginning of World War II, including the Germans. And certainly better than anything we had at that point. Highly maneuverable, could climb 10,000 feet a minute. The pilots, we didn't think were very smart, didn't do some of the things we thought they should have been doing, but they were gutsy. They would fly on dual barrel roll in front of a formation of airplanes, each having 12 50 caliber machine guns that could be directed at a fighter. The Jap Zeros typically would attempt to climb, get above our altitude, and be somewhere between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and then come in toward us in a dive, very high speed, and they did a lot of damage. My plane had 141 holes that the ground crew had patched. They kept track of them, and I think most everybody had that result. In my case, nothing got hit that was of serious nature that would take us down. On one occasion, I had a bullet from a Jap Zero go through the fuselage and out the other side, passing right behind my head. We were fortunate. I believe that they were shooting close to 50 caliber. That would be like close to 1/2 inch. Any time between the initial point and target, the gunners were expected to be scanning the skies for the approach of any bandits from any direction, making sure that we got a shot at them if they got a shot at us. And we had fighter attacks probably on maybe 2/3 of the missions we flew. Other ones, for some reason, we avoided them. The guns were located 2 on the belly, 2 on the top of the fuselage, and of course the tail gunner. Those 50 caliber machine guns were capable of being fired by any one of the gunners, including the bombardier, remotely sighting from his own gun sight. And the computer gave the proper speed and lead for firing those guns with a little better accuracy than we could have ever gotten with the B-17 with its manual aiming. After each drop, we were all anxious to get away from the target because that target, if well defended, was not a good place to be. We picked up a little speed on the peel-off. We headed out for the coast. After arriving at the coast, we were good and safe from fighters, probably after only 15-20 minutes off the coast because we were then out of the fuel range of the Zero. Iwo Jima was important to the bombing of Japan in that it provided a home base for B-29s who couldn't make it back to Tinian, and a place where people who were short of gas or with damage could land and wait out a repair. Important because it let all of the B-29s run on a mission with a little bit less gas because they had a place they could get some gas. They could carry some more bombs because they didn't have to carry quite so much gas. The auxiliary gas was coming as they landed at Iwo Jima. Out of the 32 missions I flew, I landed Iwo Jima 9 times. The first time was when we received the information in briefing that the Marines had secured one end of the Jap landing strip, a runway that they had used for their fighters. But we were warned, be sure that you approach it from this direction and stop at the end of the island we've got pretty secure. And we got fired at with small rifle fire on the approach to those first mission stoppages. All of the B-29 pilots will tell you that they admire the Marines, and we lost about 6,000 Marines taking that island. So it was a costly bit of insurance that we bought for our B-29s, and the reverse was true from the takeoff when we landed after a mission. Our first task was to inform the ground crew of anything we knew that was deficient about the plane, and then we were trucked to a debriefing center where we were given 4 ounces of whiskey and a series of questions by people who were looking to find out what kind of success we had had on the mission. And then after the debriefing was over, we went and get a meal and then in the sack. The flight crews all appreciated the ground crews, and typically ground crews were about 4 guys. They built themselves a shack at the hardstand. Nights of missions, that's where they were, waiting for us when we returned. But we appreciated them so much that they received a jug of whiskey derived from a trip made to Guam by one of the Tinian B-29s, and their haulback was cases of whiskey. And there was a bottle for every crew. Our crew got that bottle designed to go to our airplane and went to the ground crew. One end of the island of Tinian had a port where there was almost always a ship being unloaded, a ship with gasoline, a ship with ammunition, a ship with food, whatever was needed and ordered by Tinian. And I'm not sure how many of those were shipping companies versus the Navy, but I knew that there was always a ship there unloading, and between that port and North Field was probably about 7 miles, and they went from the port to the North Field on a 4-lane divided highway filled with trucks hauling stuff from the port to the airport. You stop and think that every plane that went on a mission weighed about 79,000 pounds dry and about 130,000 pounds as it took off to go on a mission. That difference was made up mostly of fuel, ammunition, and an explosive of some sort. And that's nearly 50,000 pounds for every plane for every mission. And you figure that out, that means there's an awful lot of material that had to be hauled to Tinian. A lesser amount, of course, to Guam and Saipan because they didn't have as many airplanes flying as many missions as Tinian had. But that was a tremendous effort, well done by the Navy, and we don't want to forget to thank the Seabees who went over and built the runways on the islands, built the Quonset huts that we later got to stay in as a replacement to our tents, and fed us, starting with K-rations. Never did get to the filet mignon end of the food quality, but we got a lot better than K-rations. Again, that's a tribute to the people hauling stuff there. Over the course of the bombing of Japan by B-29s, we lost probably something in the order of 20% of our crews and planes. Some of the crews we picked up at the end of the war out of the prisoner of war camps. Some of them we picked out of the water if they'd gotten off the coast and ditched. And it didn't make too much difference. We could lose airplanes on any of the three types of bombing missions, and I don't know which ones were the highest losses. When we were on a mission over Japan, everybody aboard on a flight crew, I'm sure, was scared. Didn't talk about it, but the common feeling of everybody, particularly in the early part of the war, you learned that you were able to make a mission and not get shot down. So the fear lessened with time. Later missions, you'd been on a lot of missions and you hadn't been shot down, so you had become used to that mode. The first mission is the one that was most scary, and subsequent ones were also bad.